Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to American Islamic College's Academic Lecture Forum. We are honored to have Dr. Nader Hashemi with us this evening. Before we get started, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. God tells us in the Quran, to God belongs what is in the heavens and what is on the earth, and what is between them and what is under the soil. That's Surah Taha, verse 6. Steeped in the Islamic values of creational stewardship and justice, all of us at American Islamic College believe that God has entrusted the lands and waters He created to humankind, who were created to serve God and the creation as stewards or caretakers. We also believe that we must stand for justice even when we ourselves may be implicated. So, we want to begin today by acknowledging that our campus sits on land that was originally entrusted to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, peoples whose sovereignty, culture, and very lives were violated by colonial policy. We acknowledge and honor them, their descendants, and their land and waterways. Through rigorous scholarship and a commitment to social justice and Islamic values, the collective good, civic involvement, interfaith understanding, and intercultural engagement, American Islamic College prepares students to become critical thinkers, visionary leaders, and responsible global citizens. In addition to our accredited degree programs and courses, programs like these provide educational opportunities for the exchange of knowledge and learning, and not just for the Muslim community, but also for the wider public. You can learn more about us by visiting our website, www.aicusa.edu. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Nader Hashemi. Dr. Hashemi is the director of the Alwaleed Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and associate professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic politics at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. His intellectual and research interests lie at the intersection of comparative politics and political theory. In particular, debates on the global rise of authoritarianism, religion and democracy, secularism and its discontents, Middle East and Islamic politics, democratic and human rights struggles in non-Western societies, and Islam-West relations. He is the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies, and is also a co-editor of a 4-volume study on Islam and human rights, critical concepts in Islamic studies. His next book project focuses on explaining the global divide over Israel-Palestine. And I'm going to drop your website, Dr. Hashemi, in the chat so our attendees can take a look at all the other work that you have done. And we're so honored to have you. You'll be speaking today on Palestine and the politics of Muslim identity. We thank you so very much, and we'll take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Assalamu alaikum to everyone, and especially a sincere thanks to my good friend Timothy Giannotti for the invitation. Um, we spent a wonderful week together in the deep Canadian forest teaching an Islamic ethics class to young kids. All I can say is I can't wait to go back again next year. It's an honor to be with everyone tonight to speak about, a very important topic that you're all familiar with. These are obviously perilous times. The US-backed genocide in Gaza is a watershed moment in global affairs, especially between the West and the Islamic world, that has produced a massive rupture in relations between the global North and the global South, including deep divisions within Western societies. I deeply believe that the genocide in Gaza is the great moral issue of the 21st century, and it will, haunt our world for a very long time. And this is precisely what I want to speak about over the next 30 minutes. I want to take one aspect of this particular topic and hopefully shed some light on it for you. So the key overarching question of my presentation is the following. Why does the Israel-Palestine conflict generate such intense polarization, bitterness, and acrimony on a global scale, in contrast to other conflicts that often kill more people and sometimes have lasted longer? The attention that the Israel-Palestine conflict, generates domestically, internationally, is truly extraordinary. In terms of land mass, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories are roughly the size of Haiti or Armenia. In terms of civilian casualties, the death toll in Gaza has been truly catastrophic since October the 7th. But wars in other parts of the world, in Myanmar, in Syria, Sudan, Ethiopia have also been extremely violent without producing the same level of global interest or debate. Why? My hypothesis is that the Israel-Palestine conflict is a unique conflict because it has the dubious distinction of being connected to two powerful and dominant themes of the 20th century. On the one hand, Nazism and the legacy of the Holocaust, and on the other hand, the struggle for decolonization in the global South. It's my contention that the Israel-Palestine conflict is a civilizational fault line between the West and the Arab Islamic world, including large parts of the global South. Both sides approach this topic from different historical experiences, sensitivities, and ethical frameworks, but with the same passion and rigor. In this talk, I want to focus on the global South, the Arab and Islamic world in particular, and the question of Palestine. Why does this conflict resonate so deeply in this part of the world among Muslims? Indeed, it can be affirmed that the question of Palestine is a key marker of Muslim identity today in the late 20th and early 21st century. The issue of Palestine is the prism of pain through which Arabs and Muslims see the outside world. The precise reasons for this, however, are poorly understood, especially in the West. Explicating this topic is the goal of my talk tonight. Why this Muslim obsession with Palestine? Why not other cases of mass atrocities and genocide where Muslims have been victimized, such as the Uyghurs, the Rohingya, the Kurds, the Sudanese, or in Syria, where 500,000 people, mostly Muslim, were killed after the 2011 Arab Spring revolt? This question is not a rhetorical one because it is featured quite prominently in the Western debate over the Israel-Palestine conflict in recent years. Supporters of Israel frequently argue that the disproportionate focus at the United Nations, for example, on Israel's human rights record in comparison to other countries reveals an anti-Semitic bias. Do they have a point? Now, if you look at and tabulate, as I've done, UN votes at the Security Council and at the General Assembly, you do objectively see a disproportionate focus over the decades on the question of Israel-Palestine in contrast to other conflicts. Why is this the case and how can it be explained? Derek Pensler, the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard, has recently weighed in on this topic. In seeking to explain the sui generis nature of the Israel-Palestine conflict, especially the intense acrimony and emotion that it produces on a global scale, he argues that it's perfectly a legitimate question to ask about when it comes to double standards. Why Israel and not Syria or the Uyghurs, he says, is a fair question, he writes, but when employed as a form of advocacy, what about is in fact a hostile response, a means of suppressing criticism. When raised in connection with Israel, it commonly invokes anti-Semitism as the ultimate explanation of global ire against the Jewish state. He begins his recently published essay, Passion in Palestine, with the observation that, quote, anti-Semitism has always played a role for the animus toward Israel. But he does acknowledge it's not the only factor. These observations overlap with official Israeli policy. Why are so many people condemning Israel? Benjamin Netanyahu recently asked. But not a word was said about the millions massacred or uprooted from their homes in the Syrian civil war or in Yemen's internal war and elsewhere. The answer, Netanyahu affirms, is, quote, the virus of anti-Semitism. This evening, I seek to offer an alternative explanation of this topic with special attention to the history and politics of Muslim societies. It'll be argued that anti-Semitism does not explain the contemporary Muslim obsession with Israel-Palestine. Rather, it is the legacy of colonialism and Israel's connection with this legacy that offers a more compelling explanatory framework. To appreciate this argument, one needs to abandon a Eurocentric understanding of modern history and replace it with a global understanding, where decolonization and the struggle for independence was the political theme for the global South during the 20th century. So on the question of decolonization, the world that we're living in today bears the footprints of the history of colonialism and the struggle for decolonization, especially after World War II. Time doesn't allow me to cover this period, but suffice to say that decolonization is widely regarded as one of the fundamental processes in making of the modern world. This shift from a world order dominated by great powers, most of them European and white, to a world of nation states is central to this story. It's hard to imagine our modern world without this great transition taking place. In summarizing the moral and political importance of this topic, the Indian intellectual Pankaj Mishra makes an important observation about the 20th century that is generally underappreciated in the West. The key event that marked the 20th century for most of humanity, for most of the world, was not World War I or World War II or the rise of fascism in Europe, the Holocaust, the Cold War, or the fall of the Berlin Wall. Decolonization, observes Mishra, is the central event of the 20th century for an overwhelming majority of the human population. And of course, he's talking about the global South. Now, decolonization also involved violence. European colonial powers engaged in dirty wars and counterinsurgency operations to retain control of their colonies. State violence was justified in the name of anti-terrorism, security threats, and national emergencies. The key characteristics of these dirty wars of decolonization involved torture, disappearances, assassinations, summary executions, collective punishment, mass detention without trial, and population transfer. All of these practices have been outlawed by the Fourth Geneva Conventions, yet they featured quite prominently in efforts to crush struggles for national independence. Some of the most violent cases involved Muslim populations. From 1945 to 1949, the Dutch, with British support, fought a bloody war to retain its colony in Indonesia. This has been described as the first modern war of decolonization, and it resulted in the death of approximately 100,000 Indonesians. In a major historical review in 2022 by the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies and the Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies, it was determined that the Dutch government and military leadership deliberately condoned the systematic and widespread use of extreme violence by the Dutch armed forces in the war against the Republic of Indonesia. To date, the Dutch government has never apologized or admitted responsibility for these atrocities. For 132 years, France occupied Algeria. This brutal experience represents one of the classic cases of European colonialism. During the struggle for decolonization, a war erupted from 1952 to 1960, from 1954 to 1962, where French repression led to the death of almost 1 million Algerians, approximately 10% of the population. French policy was replete with all of the key features of dirty wars, especially the widespread and systematic use of torture. While Emmanuel Macron has called France's role in Algeria a crime against humanity, he has steadfastly refused to offer a formal apology. This topic is a deeply divisive one in France today. Macron's own prime minister has criticized those who, quote, regret colonization because he says doing so could bolster political Islam. Macron, however, has apologized to those Algerians who collaborated with the French during Algeria's War of Independence, and he has offered these Algerian collaborators reparations and financial compensation. Now, arguably, the most brutal war of decolonization happened in Vietnam. 500,000 people were killed in the First Indochina War when France was the main external power blocking Vietnamese independence. Roughly 2 million people were killed due to U.S. policy in Vietnam from 1955 to 1975. After the Vietnam War, Jimmy Carter was asked if the United States had a moral obligation to help rebuild Vietnam, and he answered no, because, and I'm quoting Carter, because the destruction was mutual. Jimmy Carter added, quote, I don't feel that we ought to apologize or to castigate ourselves or to assume the status of culpability. And I don't feel that we owe a debt, nor that we should be forced to pay reparations, end quote. Malaysia was another location where a dirty war to block decolonization took place. Britain called it the Malaya Emergency from 1948 to 1960. And the big fear that the British had in Malaysia was losing control over valuable resources, specifically rubber and tin. The British crackdown on a left-wing nationalist insurgency was replete with scorched earth policies, extrajudicial killings, and aerial bombardment that included the use of Agent Orange, a chemical compound. Between 400,000 and 1 million civilians were forcibly located into new villages that one scholar has called concentration camps. Lessons learned in Malaysia were applied by the British in Kenya. In the context of the Mau Mau Rebellion in the late 1950s, brutal tactics were adopted to crush another decolonization struggle. In her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Imperial Reckoning, The Untold Story of Britain's Gulag in Kenya, Caroline Elkins discovered that the British actually detained some 1.5 million people, or the entire Kikuyu population, during this time period. She documents the horrific conditions within these detention camps and the British counterinsurgency strategy that devastated large parts of Kenyan society. The Kenyan Human Rights Commission said 90,000 people were executed, tortured, or maimed during this period, while the scholar John Blackener has argued that 50,000 people died, half of them children under the age of 10. What Elkins reveals in her study on Kenya is that not only did Britain, in the name of Enlightenment values, ruthlessly crush a rebellion, but also that Britain tried to cover it up. In the final days of their colonial rule, all documentation on British torture tactics and mass incarceration were ordered destroyed. The decolonization of Portuguese Africa from 1960 to 1974 followed a similar pattern of colonial state violence and counterinsurgency repression. And the story goes on and on. Now, there's a much longer and deeper history of colonialism and imperialism. Time doesn't permit me to do a full recounting of it. But the above analysis is just a small survey of the violence and destruction unleashed by Western colonial powers in the final phase of their colonial rule and in the context of struggles for decolonization in the post-World War II period. A few important facts, however, about the enduring legacy of colonialism are worth noting. Number one, the brutal legacy of colonialism and the struggle for decolonization has produced a collective memory in the global South. From this long ordeal, oral and written histories of colonialism, from the standpoint of its victims, has been created and bequeathed to successive generations. As Pankaj Mishra has perceptively observed in this experience, this collective memory has produced also a cultural memory and a historical memory of the atrocities inflicted on large parts of the world by Western powers. And as a result, this has shaped the global South's collective identity. In a very deep and profound sense, this legacy of colonialism has also deeply informed how people of the global South see themselves in the world and position themselves in the world today. Examples of how this collective identity shapes societies can be seen in the origin stories of many of these post-colonial states in Africa and Asia, which are inseparable from the history of colonial subjugation and the struggle to break free from it. The founding figures and early leaders of these states cut their teeth and earned their bona fides during the decolonization struggle. Many of them were anti-colonial leaders and resistance fighters, some of whom took up arms in the struggle for national independence. Ho Chi Minh, Ahmed Ben Bella, Fidel Castro, Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Samora Machel, Amilcar Cabral, Ahmed Sukarno, Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Nelson Mandela. Today they are remembered by their societies as national heroes and celebrated icons whose images appear on stamps and buildings, statues have been erected in their honor, and their life stories are taught in school curricula. The official national story of these new states was formed against the backdrop of the legacy of colonialism and carried into the post-colonial era. In reading through the history of colonialism, another theme emerges: the divide between civilization and barbarism. This persistent motif is best described by Edward Said in his thesis on Orientalism. Axiom one of Orientalism is, quote, the absolute and systematic difference between the West, which is allegedly rational, developed, humane, superior, and the Orient, which is allegedly aberrant, underdeveloped, and inferior. Another axiom of Orientalism is the belief that the Orient is at bottom something either to be feared, the yellow peril, the Mongol hordes, the brown dominions, or to be controlled. The persistence of this idea was captured by Bernard Lewis in the context of justifying the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, where Lewis wrote that either we bring them freedom or they destroy us. Consistently, this fault line runs through the entire history of colonialism, the civilization versus barbarism fault line, and it does not really recede. I would argue this theme still exists today, especially in the context of Western policy toward the Arab and Islamic world. Even during the era of decolonization, this binary between civilization versus barbarism persisted. Western colonial attitudes did not substantively change over time. Local resistance to colonial rule was constantly interpreted as proof of the backward nature of the natives. In Kenya, for example, British colonial authorities viewed the Kikuyu as an inferior race and thereby justified brutal repression of their uprising. This sentiment was deeply rooted in the belief of the superiority of British civilization versus the alleged backwardness of Kenyan society. An identical set of binary claims, arguments, and beliefs existed in the context of the French in Algeria and in Vietnam, the British in India and Malaysia, the Dutch in Indonesia, and the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique. Another theme that emerges from this experience of decolonization and that is ensconced in the collective memory of colonized societies today is Western hypocrisy and double standards. Recall the conquest of the global South was justified in the name of spreading European Enlightenment values. The British called it the white man's burden. The French called it a civilizing mission. It suggested that the West had a moral obligation to educate, modernize, and civilize the non-Western world. Built into this equation were several assumptions. First, that any opposition to European control was proof that the unrestrained emotion had triumphed in the native instead of controlled reason. Violent resistance suggested something worse, that the native was indeed a savage of lowest order, whose death could be justified in the name of human progress, using massive violence if needed. Western hypocrisy was eventually noted by intellectuals in the global South. It slowly became part of their collective memory and identity, and it was not easily forgotten. This memory still lingers today. Reflecting on this point, the late Pakistani intellectual Iqbal Ahmed has observed that, quote, our first encounter with democracy was oppressive. Democracy came to us as oppressors, as colonizers, as violators. As violators, they spoke the language of the Enlightenment and engaged in the activities of barbarians. Secondly, after decolonization, Iqbal continues, after decolonization, our experience was again with the democratic power centers, the United States, France, and Britain. Our experience, even in the second stage of our post-colonial history, was one of these great big Western powers calling themselves the free world and actively promoting neo-fascism and neo-fascist governments in one Muslim country and third world country after another. Now, what does all of this have to do with the question of Palestine? Everything. Most of the Islamic world lies in Africa and in Asia. Its modern historical political experience overlaps with the above discussion. The primary reason why the question of Palestine looms so large in the intellectual and moral imagination of Muslims today is due to the Muslim experience with colonialism and decolonization. This has produced an enduring legacy, and it has palpable connections to the Israel-Palestine conflict. What are these connections? Well, consider what's happening in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. There's a foreign occupying army. This army presides over land confiscations, house demolitions, population expulsions, new settlement construction, and it upholds a racist legal system is in favor of Israeli settlers. This occupation is replete with massive daily violence against the indigenous Palestinian population that constitute clear war crimes under international law. All of this is happening and has been happening since at least 1967 in the case of the West Bank, with critical support from Western liberal democracies. Confirming this situation is the voluminous human rights documentation on the Israel-Palestine conflict. In 2021, B'Tselem, Israel's leading human rights organization, issued a report called A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. This publication was followed up a year later by a more detailed 217-page report by Human Rights Watch and then a 280-page report by Amnesty International. Both confirmed the B'Tselem claim of Israeli apartheid. Hundreds of human rights reports by various branches of the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, the International Commission of Jurists, and multiple rulings by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have produced a massive and irrefutable record that corroborates the above depiction of what's happening in Israel-Palestine today. It's difficult to think of an existing parallel case in our world. These facts serve as a constant reminder for Muslims and people in the global South that the theme of colonialism is alive and well. This reality sends a message that colonialism is not an experience from a bygone era, but rather it is a reality of our present moment. In other words, the ongoing conflict in Israel Palestine is viewed by Muslims as an inescapable form of colonialism in your face that comes with all of its attendant features and attributes: dehumanization, powerlessness, defeat, humiliation, and anger. The non resolution of the Israel Palestine conflict keeps the issue of colonialism alive as a burning and unresolved topic for Muslims, and indeed also for large parts of the global South. It has a re-traumatizing impact on societies that were previously colonized. The phrase post-traumatic stress disorder on a collective level comes to mind. These painful memories maintain a focus on this issue as a burning topic at the forefront of the political consciousness of the global South. The sui generis nature of Palestine can also be explained by the broader geography of the Islamic world. In looking at a map of Muslim majority societies, Palestine is one of the few remaining areas where the final status of this territory is yet to be determined. What are the final borders of Israel, and where might a future Palestinian state be located? International law is clear on this question. Israel has no legal claim over territory occupied after the 1967 war. The problem is that both Israel and the United States reject this clear legal position, and they seek to alter it by force of arms. Thus, legally speaking, we know the answer about the final status of the borders of Israel and of a Palestinian state. Politically and militarily, however, given the huge imbalance and asymmetry in power between the two sides, the future of Israel-Palestine remains an unresolved question. It is precisely because of the ongoing nature of this conflict and that it continues to produce death and destruction, mostly on the Palestinian side, that this topic remains relevant for Muslim politics. When Muslim leaders and intellectuals and organizations comment on the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's often the human rights situation that commands attention. The loss of Palestinians' life, as we're seeing in Gaza today, is truly staggering. When the horrors of the war are broadcast globally, Muslims predictably respond with condemnation and outrage. But how to address the argument of Muslim double standards? Why do human rights crises that involve the mass killing of Muslims in Syria or Sudan, for example, not elicit the same type of condemnation? During the 1980s, according to Amnesty International, 200,000 people were killed in Algeria's civil war in what was known as the Black Decade. Why did such mass death not produce the same level of political mobilization and condemnation? The explanation lies in the legacy of colonialism. Recall Pankaj Mishra's observation that decolonization is the central event of the 20th century for an overwhelming majority of the human population. This transformative event spanned generations and shaped the collective identity of new nations in the global South, including in the Muslim world. This experience is part of the DNA of the Muslim world and of global South countries. It is firmly lodged in their collective memory, and it is central to understanding the global South's obsession with Palestine today. Critically, the power dynamics in Israel-Palestine replicates the colonial past. It has the same characters, plot line, scenes, and this drama is being performed on a stage in the heart of the Arab Islamic world for over the last 100 years. From within the region, the Israel-Palestine conflict looks like a Shakespearean tragedy with no end. Similar comparisons of this nature do not apply to the case of the Uyghurs, Syria, or Sudan, where the key actors, the plot line, the time frame, and the power dynamics are substantively different. The direct role of the West in its one-sided support for Israel is a critical factor here. This explains the uniqueness of the question of Palestine and the passions that surround it. Consider further similarities between the colonial past and Israel-Palestine today. The characters in this drama are the same, mostly white European settlers, many with Brooklyn accents, persecuting non-white native populations. The racial element is clear. The fact that these settlers are supported militarily, politically, diplomatically, and financially by the former colonial powers in France and Britain and now the United States highlights this racial dimension and keeps the colonial comparison alive. On the question of violence, we see a massive amount of it, but disproportionately employed by different sides. Identical arguments in justification for repression from the colonial past also follow in terms of what's happening in Israel-Palestine today. The violence of the colonized is condemned and called terrorism, while the violence of the colonizer is supported in the name of self-defense. Do the natives have the right of self-defense? Totally ignored in the Western debate on Israel-Palestine is the inherent structural violence of the colonial project that produces mass violence on a daily basis. The next throwback to the colonial period that echoes today is the theme of hypocrisy and moral virtue. For a long time, Western liberal intellectuals and governments have lectured Muslim societies about the importance of human rights and the rule of law. These lectures increased after key moments in tension between Islam and the West, especially after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the Salman Rushdie affair, the rise of the Taliban, and significantly after 9/11. Many sermons, speeches, essays, and books were written on this theme. After the Danish cartoon controversy and the attack on the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris, Muslims were instructed to read Voltaire and to respect freedom of opinion and political pluralism. Now consider Gaza before 2023. From 2008 to 2023, there have been five major eruptions of violence in Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2018, and 2021. The dead have mostly been Palestinians killed with weapons made in the United States. For example, during the 2008 war in Gaza, human rights groups have documented nearly 1,400 Palestinian deaths, of which four-fifths were civilians, including 350 children. In that war, 10 Israeli soldiers were killed, four by friendly fire, as well as three Israeli civilians. The ratio of Palestinians to Israelis killed during this episode was 100 to 1. The ratio of Palestinian civilians to Israeli civilians killed during this war was 400 to 1. This ratio holds true for other wars in Gaza mentioned above. How did Western governments, liberal intellectuals, and the establishment media respond? They provided they provided unflinching support for Israel in the name of self-defense and civilizational progress. The 2018 March of Return in Gaza deserves mention in this context. On the 70th anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba, Palestinians in Gaza organized a nonviolent march to the Gaza border to mark this solemn occasion. It was a peaceful march in the tradition of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Israel responded by lining up its best snipers on the border and systematically and methodically shooting at the protesters. A chilling UN report documents the violence. According to this report, 214 Palestinians, including 46 children, were killed, and over 36,000 people, including nearly 8,800 children, were injured. How did Western governments respond to this peaceful protest by the people of Gaza? The U.S. blamed Hamas for the violence and said Israel had the right to protect its border, and the U.K. opposed a UN Security Council resolution critical of Israel. And then came October the 7th, 2023. Israel's response to the Hamas attack was to unleash a genocide in Gaza with unflinching Western backing. The West rallied to Israel's support politically, militarily, and diplomatically, jettisoning all pretense to uphold human rights or international law. The dominant Western narrative, for at least the first year and a half of the war, revolved entirely around Israel. The Palestinians only factored into the equation as an appendage to this broader narrative. Joe Biden repeatedly claimed to have seen atrocities that did not exist. Keir Starmer, a UK human rights barrister and the current prime minister, argued that Israel had the right to withhold water and power from the people of Gaza. Annalena Baerbock, Germany's foreign minister, suggested civilian sites in Gaza could lose their protective status, where Jürgen Habermas, Europe's most distinguished intellectual and defender of the Enlightenment, supported Israel's military response while ignoring the suffering of the Palestinians. When the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court intervened to hold Israel accountable for its atrocities, these rulings were summarily dismissed by one Western government after another. For the first 6 months of the Israel-Gaza war, the number of children killed was staggering. An average of 100 children were being killed per day. The United Nations revealed that the number of children reportedly killed in just over 4 months in Gaza is higher than the number of children killed in 4 years of war around the world combined. None of this affected Western support for Israel's war aims in Gaza. The arms kept flowing to Israel, and demands for a ceasefire were routinely rejected. What particularly highlighted the hypocrisy of the West on Gaza was the contrast with Ukraine. At the exact time that Western leaders rallied to condemn human rights violations, aggression, annexation, occupation, and the sanctity of international law in Eastern Europe, they adopted the opposite posture in the Middle East. The International Criminal Court arrest warrant on Vladimir Putin was broadly celebrated, while the arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu was broadly rejected. All of this echoes a familiar discourse and framing from the colonial era on human rights and moral virtue that is ripe with double standards and hypocrisy. So I'm coming to an end here. Realize I'm over my time. The Western establishment media, from CNN to BBC to the New York Times, followed a similar trajectory. At the New York Times, journalists were instructed not to use the word genocide, ethnic cleansing, and occupied territory. And the New York Times refused to publish an advertisement from the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization with a long history of peace advocacy and support for social justice causes around the world. This advertisement read, quote, "Tell Congress to stop arming Israel's genocide in Gaza now. As a Quaker organization, we work for peace. Join us. Tell the president and Congress to stop the killing and starvation in Gaza." The point of contention in this ad was the word genocide. Another noteworthy media fact is Israel has consistently denied foreign journalists access to Gaza. The champions of free speech and free press in the West have responded broadly with crickets. The dichotomy between civilization and barbarism is another longstanding colonial theme that I've mentioned already, and this was also on display and has been on display in the context of Gaza. Israeli leaders repeatedly emphasize this topic. This war is a war that is not only between Israel and Hamas, Israeli President Isaac affirmed. It's a war that is intended really and truly to save Western civilization, to save the values of Western civilization, he said. Liberal intellectuals like Bernard-Henri Lévy from France agrees. He said, in this very precise sense, we can say that Israel, like Ukraine, is fighting a battle of civilization, the battle for rights, for democracy, the anti-totalitarian and anti-imperialist battle of our time. When asked which country best represents this civilizational battle for freedom, Levy said, maybe Germany, the one Western country that has effectively criminalized free speech on Israel-Palestine, it should be added. When he was pressed further, he said the Germans have been, quote, impeccable. The civilization versus barbarism theme and framing of the Israel-Palestine conflict has been an old and enduring one in the West. It echoes a persistent colonial theme going back to the early theoreticians of Zionism. Theodor Herzl argued in the late 19th century precisely this point. The creation of a Jewish state would, according to Herzl, form a wall of defense for Europe and Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. The contrast between these claims and Israel's near total destruction of Gaza's rich cultural heritage, including the obliteration of all educational institutions, hundreds of mosques, is worth noting in the context of a discussion of the West, the Islamic world, and the idea of civilization. It recalls that famous quip attributed to Gandhi when he was asked what he thought about Western civilization, and allegedly he responded, "I think it would be a good idea." Let me just conclude. In November 2010, President Barack Obama made an official visit to Indonesia. In the previous year, he had delivered a famous speech in Cairo, where he sought to reduce tensions between the West and the Islamic world that had reached a fever pitch after 9/11, especially after the American invasion of Iraq. Obama's Cairo speech had been called a new beginning. When the Secretary General of Indonesia's Prosperous and Justice Party was asked to comment on Obama's outreach to the Muslim world, he replied that Muslims would judge Obama and the West by a single issue. Quote, what will Obama do in resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict? If we don't see any progress on this issue, what he says is just a speech. I've tried to argue tonight that the legacy of colonialism and Israel's connection with this legacy provide an objective analytical framework to understand the relationship between Muslims and the Israel-Palestine conflict. When Harvard historian Derek Pensler, reflecting on these global divisions that have emerged on this subject recently, says that, quote, anti-Semitism has always played a role for animus toward Israel, he is unconsciously importing a Eurocentric framework into this conversation. Historically, anti-Semitism was a European malady for which there is no Asian, African, or Middle Eastern parallel. The Holocaust happened in Europe, not in the Middle East. In this context, it is worth noting that there was no anti Semitic literature in Arabic. Anti Semitic literature had to be translated from European languages into Arabic in the context of the early origins of the Israel Palestine conflict. And it's a recent historical development. The conclusion drawn from our analysis is that Muslim criticism of Israel is not motivated by Jewish hatred, but rather by a hatred of colonialism and all of its disfiguring attributes. The Tunisian Jewish intellectual Albert Memmi came close to capturing this point. He spent his entire life preoccupied by the lived experience of colonialism. He was especially concerned with exploring the damaging psychological effects of oppression on those who suffer under it. In his preface to James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, he writes, this is Memmi writing, quote, injustice, injury, humiliation, and insecurity can be as unbearable as hunger. A common theme that ties all systems of oppression together, he wrote, is the humiliating denial of dignity. Are there anti-Semites in the Muslim world? Yes. Is this the key driver of Muslim animosity toward Israel? No. To argue this point ignores the long history of Muslim-Jewish coexistence, especially in Andalusia, Islamic Spain, and in the Ottoman Empire, and in many other parts of the Arab and Islamic world. It also ignores the modern experience of colonized societies and the theme of decolonization that gave shape to the modern identities of countries in the global south. All of this recalls a statement from Nelson Mandela on the question of Palestine. After his release from prison, Mandela frequently spoke about the question of Palestine and consistently expressed his solidarity for justice in Palestine. He observed famously in one comment, quote, we know all too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. We know all too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. What did Mandela mean? I think the answer lies in the above analysis that I've just provided. The fact that Palestine is one of the few remaining parts of the global south where a colonial project remains in place, and in the context of Gaza, is expanding in the context of a colonial policy by the state of Israel, backed by the West, speaks to Mandela's point. There is a clear inference in Mandela's comments to the interconnectedness of struggles for human emancipation and political freedom. There is also a recognition by Mandela of the collective solidarity of colonized societies who've endured similar experiences that shape who they are and how they see themselves in the world today. No one is free, Mandela argued, until everyone is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hashemi. Thank you for taking us through that history. I'd now like to open it up for questions. You can unmute yourself, I believe, or raise your hand, or you can also drop a question in the chat.
If no one else is going to start, I will. My video is disabled, Nader, but I'm so grateful for your presence with us tonight, and I love learning from you. This is really powerful. Can you just? This is a really simple question, but where do we place Ireland in the global South when we're thinking about this decolonial identity and mentality?
Well, that's a great question. There are outlying cases here. So it's interesting to ask why Ireland is sort of has balked the broader Western trend. And if you go to Ireland, you talk to Irish people, you look at the statements of the Irish government, they are very supportive of the Palestinians. And the reason why is because Ireland's modern experience maps very easily over to the struggle of the Palestinians in terms of their sense of colonization by the British. They understand all of the themes that I've talked about, the repression, the violence, how the theme of civilization versus barbarism, the double standards. So the Irish understand Palestine in ways that many people in the global South do because of their modern lived experience. I think that's broadly the reason why, Ireland is one of the outlying cases in Europe that explains, why the Irish people tend to be very pro-Palestine in contrast to, let's say, people in England or people in France.
Nader, this is Fred Lawson. It's very nice presentation. I'm absolutely persuaded. You've got me wondering the same way as the previous question. So perhaps in China, the case of China against the Uyghurs, the colonialism is not white colonialism. And so it's not particularly seen as a colonial relationship. And with respect to Russia and the Caucasus, that would be a white colonial relationship. I wonder why Dagestan and Chechnya aren't paid quite as much attention, along the lines of your argument, as Palestine.
That's a great question. Yeah, those questions frequently come up. I would argue actually that if you speak to Uyghurs and you read their history, they view their modern experience very much in the same context of colonization that I've outlined, where they have been the victims of, Han Chinese persecution and subjugation. The reason why I think those cases that you've identified don't generate the same type of passion and mobilization in Muslim majority societies is for the reason that I mentioned in my talk, that the power dynamics and the actors, don't map identically onto the question of Palestine as other cases do. And what I'm trying to say here is that, much of the colonial experience that most parts of the at least Arab world and parts of Africa and Asia that Muslims experienced were colonization by Western powers, the same Western powers that are backing Israel today. It wasn't Russia that was responsible for those types of colonial projects in parts of the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia. Certainly, Russia, I think its policies of colonization, dehumanization in Central Asia and the Caucasus would fall into the same, dynamics of persecution and repression. They're just generally not as well known to the broader Muslim communities in the Middle East, in Africa. And then plus also there's the post World War II history as well that plays in, at least rhetorically, the Soviet Union and even Putin today rhetorically, have expressed solidarity with the Palestinian cause, for example, and have been critical of Western imperialism, I think in a very insincere way. But nonetheless, that's also a dynamic that plays into this equation. So I think the actual, story of colonization and dehumanization of what Russia has done to the Caucasus and to Central Asia, and what China has done to the Uyghurs does fit a broader sort of, colonial imperial project, but its global resonance doesn't have the same type of impact in the rest of the Islamic world for the reasons that I mentioned.
Thank you for that. We have a question in the chat from Dr. Ibrahim Ozdemir. Thank you, Dr. Nader. We know much about the role of religion in colonization, but what about decolonization? We have seen symbolic gestures in recent years, such as the late Pope Francis asking forgiveness from indigenous peoples in Bolivia and Canada, yet at the same time, we witness a persistent deafness in much of the West toward the plight of indigenous Christians in Palestine, the very birthplace of Jesus. How should we understand the responsibilities and possibilities of religion in this decolonizing moment, and how can faith traditions avoid repeating the colonial entanglements of the past while becoming authentic partners in justice and reconciliation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, of course, when we talk about religion in the West, there are many different manifestations of religion, let's say Christianity. So let me just highlight and compare and contrast two figures that that everyone watching will know. So we have we have Christians like the current U.S. ambassador in Israel is very Christian, a man by the name of Mike Huckabee, and then we also have the late Pope Francis, also Christian. Their attitudes toward what's happening in Gaza today are very different. One justifying the genocide, drawing upon a certain Christian interpretation of what's happening, and the other also drawing on a particular interpretation of Christianity, and expressing deep solidarity with what's happening in Gaza. I mean, to his credit, the late Pope Francis, I don't know if everyone knows this, but it's really a mark of distinction. Every night before he would go to sleep, he would call the beleaguered Christian community in Gaza and offer them support and succor. He did that literally every evening after October the 7th. Even when he was ill in his last few months, when he came out of the hospital, he continued that tradition. I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of Christian groups to stop this genocide. Um, uh, in my situation right now, my current employer is Georgetown University, which is a self-identified Catholic institution with a Jesuit identity. You walk around campus, you see all these signs and slogans about, Jesuit values and the moral responsibility that, Christian ethics have, particularly Jesuits, to uphold a global, set of values for the world, faith that promotes justice. When you look around the campus today and you listen to statements from our university leadership, there's a deafening silence on what's happening in Gaza today. One of the issues we're trying to actually put on the agenda is to ask our university officials, what do Jesuit values mean in the age of genocide? Could you please tell us if these are just slogans and words that you like to sort of invoke when they're convenient, or do they actually have substance and meaning to them? So there's a lot of work that I think Christian and other religious communities can be doing and should be doing to mobilize their constituencies to stop this moral obscenity in Gaza. There are a lot of very good Christian organizations and other religious groups that are doing great work, including in many of the progressive elements within the American Jewish community who've been mobilizing to oppose what's being done in the name of world Jewry. It's truly actually inspiring when you see, people, just to give one example, Peter Beinart, who we hosted at Georgetown, draw upon his own deep engagement with his Jewish ethical tradition to oppose and speak out against what's happening in the name of what Netanyahu is doing in the name allegedly of all Jews. So these, I think, these are things that I think, um, have to be discussed at much greater depth, I think, but we have to also be clear, as I said at the beginning of my answer, religion is not a monolithic category. There are religion and religious interpretations, including among Muslims, that can be justice enhancing, human rights enhancing, democracy enhancing, and interpretations of religion that produce the exact opposite. And these are people drawing from the same sort of sacred texts. And this is just, I think, foundational to the whole question of religion. And the challenge, I think, is for those people who have a religious identity and believe that it can be a source to change the world, to draw upon, those values and those lessons from our religious heritage, to fight for a better world, a world where, everyone is included, where there's equality, where there's, human rights and respect. And so there's a lot of that happening in all of these religious traditions. I think there's a lot of more work to be done. And I hope to see it. I hope to see that those types of religious communities sort of, lead the charge toward mobilizing, global solidarity against this outrageous situation in Gaza.
Thank you. Another question. Thank you for this great presentation. I have several related questions. What about the Muslim governments in the region? What explains their policies or their lack of action? Are they truly powerless or see Palestine issue as a political threat to themselves? And could their continued inaction risk delegitimizing them in the eyes of their own people?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking it. I think one of the things that Muslims need to be doing today, especially at a college such as yours, is asking precisely these questions. We need conferences, we need seminars, we need lecture series focusing precisely on why have Muslim countries, there's over 50 Muslim countries, 1/4 of the human population are Muslim. Many of these countries are not only immensely rich, but they have powerful armies. If you look at what they've done over the last 2 years in Gaza, what one sees objectively is not just sort of silence and ineptitude, but active complicity in facilitating this genocide. Some countries more than others. Specifically, I'll just take one country, in Egypt. Egypt shares a border with Gaza. There's starving people on the other side of that border that are facing extermination, to use the language of the International Criminal Court. Why can't Egypt break that border and feed the starving people on the other side? It's a question that Muslims, I think, should be asking. But what's so shocking about this particular topic is that many Muslims are not even able to think in these terms, to ask, why isn't the Muslim world, with all of their weapons, all of their governments, not doing anything to stop this genocide? And, I don't have time to, I mean, it's a subject for a different lecture, but let me just sort of say a few things very, very quickly. There is a historical moment here that's worth remembering. In 1973, after the war between Israel and neighboring Arab states, the late leader of Saudi Arabia, a man by the name of King Faisal, organized the oil-producing countries and put a boycott on the West for its support of Israel and its policy against the Palestinians. This led to a huge crisis in the global economy. And there's actually a story here where then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, gets on a plane and flies to Riyadh, and he tries to appeal to King Faisal's sense of self-interest. There's a transcript that's, basically, we have, if you read the transcript, Kissinger tells King Faisal, "What are you doing with this oil boycott? Don't you understand that this is going to hurt the Saudi economy? You won't be able to develop and modernize. This is bad for your, stated national aims." And King Faisal allegedly responds by telling Kissinger, "We are a simple people. We come from the desert where we were raised on goat milk and dates. And if need be, we will go back to that lifestyle, but we will not abandon our Palestinian brothers." Now, the transcript ends there, but can you just imagine the expression on the face of Henry Kissinger when he hears this? There's actually a Muslim leader that's willing to stand up for ethics and to use the huge leverage that many of these Western countries have on the West to shift their policy. Tomorrow, this genocide in Gaza could stop if the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia were to pick up the phone and call Donald Trump and say, "All of these $1 billion of contracts that we recently signed on your visit to Saudi Arabia, they're frozen until the people of Gaza are able to eat again." That would end this war tomorrow. And the question is, why doesn't he do that? And I think the answer, there's many answers, but I think one reason why is that the national security interests of many of these ruling elites in the Arab and Islamic world line up with U.S. policy and Israeli policy. They want to see the defeat of any resistance to Israel in the Palestinian occupied territories because they fear that if there is a symbolic victory of armed resistance against an Israeli or American-backed order, that will then lead to the destabilization of their authoritarian regimes. If you stop and think about it, in an independent Palestinian state, there's a democracy where Palestinians have freedom of expression, you can choose your own leaders. That just by itself is a huge threat to Arab dictatorships who hate democracy. Look how they responded to the Arab Spring. So there's a lot to say on this particular topic. Some countries, I think, are more guilty than others in terms of facilitating this genocide. I mean, if just one country, let's say the Emirates, were going to say, "We're not going to buy American weapons anymore until the Israeli army pulls out of Gaza," that would be enough to, I think, end this genocide. But none of these countries want to do that because they see their interests, and I'm talking about the interests of the ruling elites, aligned with Israel. The Abraham Accords were very much about this vision where Arab dictators in Israel, backed by the United States, would create this great regional order where the Palestinians would be forgotten. And allegedly, this would be the secret element to peace in the Middle East. I mean, this was and is U.S. policy. So there's a lot to say about this topic. And I think, the last point that I'll mention is that if you look at the whole history of the Muslim community, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad into today, I can't think of any one moment where we've witnessed such a mass slaughter of Muslims and other Muslim communities have just stood on the sidelines and watch it happen. If you think of the darkest moments, the Mongol invasion and attack on Baghdad, the Crusades, even during the period of colonialism and imperialism. We've never had a comparable moment where Muslim countries had a lot of power, had a lot of influence, but chose to do nothing. And I think this is fundamentally boils down to the problem of the absence of democracy, because if Muslims had a voice, had representative government, they would force their governments to do the right thing. And in fact, what we see right now in many of these countries is that even if you have a Palestinian flag, or even on social media, if you express solidarity with the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, that's enough to get you arrested in Jordan, in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia. So that's how bad things are. And I think as we try to make sense of this dark moment in Gaza, one of the things that Muslims are going to have to think about very deeply is, why did the Muslim world, and of course, I'm talking Muslim governments, because the Muslim world largely is disenfranchised. Many countries we don't have a voice. Why did they stand on the sidelines when Gaza was being obliterated, when they had a lot of leverage that they could have used to stop this genocide, and they chose not to do it? And one day there has to be, I think, a moral reckoning and moral accounting specifically on this issue. And, I can't wait until that day comes.
So, if you don't mind, can I ask a question with you, Dr. Nader, please?
Go ahead.
All right. Let me ask you this. So, supposedly, you gave us a great lecture on the history of this, on NPR and some really good BBC News channels and whatnot. They speak about the day after plan. Do you feel that once there's a resolution between all the Arab countries that are going to possibly get involved in Gaza and the West Bank, possibly create a Palestinian state, would be a carbon copy for other Muslim countries that have issues, i.e. Kashmir, the Uyghurs, and so on and so forth?
Well, let's be clear what this day after plan is. First of all, there is no day after plan, because the day after plan, according to U.S. and Israeli policy, is mass expulsion of the Palestinians to, the last I heard, South Sudan, and that will solve the problem. But as soon as that plan doesn't go forward, and the Arab plan that was put forward, several months ago, but has been totally forgotten because it wasn't serious. Let's say that goes somewhere. That plan is basically going to be a plan where you will basically take the dictatorship of Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, bring him to Gaza, and you will have another Arab dictatorship that will manifest itself in Gaza and the West Bank, replicating the existing Arab dictatorships. There'll be some sort of fake electoral process, perhaps. And then they're going to call it, well, look, we've given Palestinians a state. Now you have it. Let's stop the complaining. If anyone thinks that these Arab states, all of them dictatorships with horrific human rights records, are going to do anything for the Palestinians, it's wishful thinking. Is this the model for other countries in the Uyghurs and Kashmir? Perhaps. I think the calculations there are very different. I think what happens to the Uyghurs is less of a concern for these Arab dictatorships, which is why they are overwhelmingly supportive of Xi Jinping and silent on the question of the Uyghurs, because they don't like, the idea. They want Chinese money and support as a balancing act for, in their relationship to the United States. Kashmir, possibly. I think the relationship with Kashmir, I think, is not essential to the political calculations of these Arab dictators. But the question of Gaza is different because it's an identity issue for Muslims. It's in the heart of the Islamic world. They do not want to see a democracy there, and they'll do everything to crush it. And so I think this is part of the, moral clarity that we need. If anyone has any hope that some sort of Arab force, like General El-Sisi, who's like perhaps one of the most brutal tyrants on the face of the planet, is going to send in some sort of, military force into Gaza, and that's going to be a good thing for the people of Gaza, well then, you got to think again, because that's not going to happen.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, but I just want to thank you so much for your expertise and going through this enlightening material, and for all of the attendees for your engagement and your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Before we close out, I just wanted to invite Dr. Timothy Giannotti to just say a few words for closing. Thank you.
No, thank you, Ramona, and thank you, Nader. This has really been it's a very somber conversation, but it's a conversation that we have to get right, one way or another. And I think many of us are wondering how given the history and the experience of other decolonization movements, how you think realistically this is going to play out. I think we all hope for a just and humane resolution and reconciliation, kind of a truth and reconciliation style emergence. But we also know that that the world doesn't always operate in such ways, and so I'm just really grateful that you've generously given your time to be with us and to help us ask the right questions and help us engage this intellectually and morally, ethically in a way that that is honest and informed. So thank you so much. We're just so
Well,
grateful.
thank you. Thank you, Timothy. I mean, I hope the American Muslim College can be a place where we can have these types of debates and discussions. Many Muslim spaces, do not want to have this conversation. So it's a huge honor for me that, you've opened up your college to have this discussion, and it's not going away. It's going to haunt our world for a very long time. So I'm hoping that we can continue talking to each other and learn from this moment and hopefully try and build a better world based on the suffering. Unfortunately, the people of Gaza won't be around to witness it, but I think we have a moral obligation as Muslims, as people who believe in ethics, who believe in human rights, to learn from this tragedy that we're seeing unfolding before our eyes.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. Okay, Assalamu alaikum.
Islam.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.